Hey everyone, welcome back to the Mean Grid and Gridiron podcast. And I'm joined once again by Rangers starting center fielder Evan Carter combo. Evan's back, and then of course Carter as always. We'll start with Evan this time.
Hey, that's right.
Evan, how you doing, man?
Not too bad. Yep, just in the bulk of wedding planning and ready for that to be over and done with. It's one of the worst things I've ever done in my life. So ready for that to be behind us. We're doing Europe for the honeymoon, so just trying to get to that point.
Sweet, yeah.
Need,
Just
need to play the ticket like Vivaldi clip there.
Yes. Yeah.
yeah, Carter's got the drops, but yeah, survive in advance to the honeymoon. That's what we're doing. But yeah, cool. Carter, how you doing?
I'm doing good. We are inching closer and closer. I don't even think I really mentally processed that we're in mid-August till yesterday. I'm starting a new job, and they gave me like a start date, and I was like, oh yeah, that's like 3 weeks away. We're good. And then they were like, no, that's in 6 days. And I was like, oh, yeah. So yeah, we were literally in the smack middle of August, and we got real college football games in about 2 weeks, 17 days. So I'm pumped. I don't know if there are ardent baseball fans listening to the podcast. I know we're baseball guys, but like, especially when your baseball team is not surging through the summer and making every game like a real enjoyable experience, like our Rangers are not. Once you get to like late July, mid August, you just have that itch where you're like, all right, give me football. Like I'm ready for football. So
yeah, no, and I'm sure any fellow fathers in the DFW area listening can attest to. Yeah, the August this snuck up on me too, especially from a kids went back to school yesterday standpoint. Yeah. So that's always crazy time, and I'm sure whether you have a kid or not, probably dealing with an uptick in traffic in the morning, regardless. So, but I think we we're doing great, all things considered. We do have some bad news to talk about. We'll start off with Caden Jenkins, starting cornerback, torn ACL out for the season. Torn ACL is not officially confirmed, but I think you can kind of there's not much wiggle room for anything else, considering he put like ACL and like a broken heart emoji on his Instagram post. And Neil Brown in his presser this week, or his media availability, he mentioned that basically he wouldn't have confirmed it, or he wouldn't have broadcasted it had it not been for social media posts. So which is kind of standard. I think coaches don't want to don't want to give that information out if they don't have to. But again, Carter, you're kind of our resident Caden Jenkins experienced guy coming in. What was your thought on losing the starting cornerback with 18 career Big 12 starts under his belt?
Yeah, I mean, he was definitely an exciting ad. I mentioned in our Mean Green group chat the other night that it was just he had a noticeable fall off after his 2023 season, and it got to the point where I think Baylor fans were kind of ready to move on. They had like an extensive window of watching him kind of falter. I went back and watched some of his tape, and it is kind of noticeable how he's lost like a little bit of a step. He seemed a little bit jumpier and more aggressive in his breakout year, and just kind of seemed to lose that edge a little bit. Obviously, I think probably would have worked out well here if he was playing this year. But he's got the athleticism, he's got the talent, but it's definitely a big loss for the secondary. But I don't know how high my expectations for him were, just given how kind of much he declined over the last couple of years, I guess. So I don't know. Obviously, injuries are never fun, and I'm not saying I'm glad anybody's hurt. I just I don't know how high I really had set my expectations for him. I just I don't know. It would have been nice to have had that kind of Big 12 addition to the secondary. Yeah. Like we all know how good he was a couple of years ago. But yeah, it's definitely a big loss, and yeah.
Devin, thoughts?
Yeah, I think Carter summed it up pretty well. The way that I think about it is, there was a lot of upside there, and everything that was coming out of camp was that he was kind of he had locked down that starting spot amidst a really deep room. So I think that he had at least gotten into a new scenario and was kind of getting a fresh start and was maybe taking advantage of that fresh start. And this is a part of the game. Every single year you can look back and we've lost at whatever point in the season, be it fall camp, be it game 4, game 6, whatever it ends up being, you lose key players. It's just a part of it. The only thing that I will say is if there is a room that we wanted to sustain this injury within, it is probably the defensive backs. And just with how deep that is and with the amount of, I think, high upside talent that we brought in, in parallel to Jenkins, there's someone that will be able to step up and be a serviceable, if not better, starter.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think that we talked about last time Chase Canada as a guy who's popped up as a someone that Neil Brown has highlighted. Keyshawn Davila at kind of that nickelback role seems like he's somebody that the coaches think is going to be a solid player. And then Peyton Taylor up from D2 Emporia State. It sounds like he's going to be another guy who, again, starter caliber. So I think that's my read, is that I don't think we were short on starter caliber guys, but I think the upside with him just having 18 career starts under his belt at the Big 12, at the P4 level is pretty hard to replace. A lot of the guys that we're counting on, Chase Canada, Davila, and Taylor, the guys I just mentioned, they have never started at the FBS level. Same for Zach Johnson's another guy that Neil Brown mentioned is kind of being in the mix at cornerback from FCS Southeastern Louisiana. So there are guys, but I think that experience is really going to be tough, especially because you've got a defensive coordinator who he has played under, implementing his defense, and that's helpful. I know cornerback isn't necessarily the position like a linebacker where you want coach on the field to explain where everybody's supposed to be, but still, regardless, I think that was a piece that Powledge brought with him for the intention of having experience in his group and being a guy he could trust. So that's tough. I think you look at some of the games like Texas State, some of these passing attacks, I think that's going to be where you might see it, where these games where it's just you got to get the field in third down and you got a good passing attack, and those are the kind of guys that you really want back in the secondary. But we'll see. I think it doesn't change the identity of the team. I think it looks like early on fall camp we're looking at a team that's going to be kind of hopefully like Neil Brown's 2023 team that went 9-4. It's going to be a ground control, ball running the ball attack, and then playing solid defense with timely passing and good efficient quarterback play. Evan, what have you kind of gleaned from what Neil Brown has been able to give us so far early in fall camp and a couple media availabilities?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that's really boding well for this team that Neil Brown has said multiple times, and man, it's just a privilege to hear this coming from inside fall camp that we haven't heard very often, and that is the depth that we have along the offensive line and the defensive line. We can get to a point of bowl eligibility this season on those facets alone. Having the ability to control the line of scrimmage and the trenches on both the offensive line, defensive line will win you lots and lots of football games, regardless of how the quarterback plays and, regardless of how the back five play at times. And so super excited about that, about having true depth on both of the lines. Kind of on the side that concerns me a little bit is the wide receiver room. I feel like, we haven't necessarily heard one name start to really, push forward in that room. We talk about Baron Tipton, for a while, but then it seems like that name kind of cools off every time we get closer to the season. I feel like Eric Morris mentioned Baron Tipton in both the 2024 and 2025 season about what his capabilities were. And then, we just see kind of the moments a little bit too big at times for Baron Tipton. But, I will say that he has all of the traits. He has the maturity now at this point as having been in the program for 3 years. And I think he could have a big season. I just want to see it be done. And then I want to see some other names start to come out of that wide receiver room. So other than that, I feel like those are kind of my highs and lows when it comes to what's coming out of the last kind of 2-3 media availabilities.
Yeah. Carter, and you mentioned that, maybe not necessarily hearing a ton so far from Morris, but do you have any early impressions on this team here at fall camp where we actually have, not a lot, but you have, some clips here and there and some comments where you're starting to see some things materialize instead of just, names on a depth chart or on a roster?
You said Morris. I'm not paying attention to Mr. Morris at all.
Did I say Morris? Oh wow, that's bad. That's like when I called the stadium Apogee a few years ago.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. No, I mean, I'm not as caught up on pressers as you guys are, but I have seen kind of the resounding statement from Neil Brown being like, the expectation is that they're like, he expects the team to be competing for the American this year. Like that is, I mean, obviously pretty much every coach idealistically believes their team is going to be at the top any given year, unless you're not a very good college football coach. But I do like that the attitude from him has just been like, why would we drop off? Why would there be any sort of stagnation? Like he intends to compete this year. And I do like that there is that sense of attitude coming from the coaches and coming from the staff is like they don't expect any sort of big drop off this year. They believe they have the talent, even with a couple of injuries in full camp, to get something done this year. And it is inspiring. Every time I see something come out about Neil Brown, I'm like, oh yeah, he's getting me fired up. So, it's probably empty calories on August 12th before he even coaches his first game. But it's better than the alternative. I would rather him be saying stuff like that and not be going around sounding like he's not sure what's going to happen with this position and not sure here and there. Like he sounds very confident when he speaks. And so I just, if you have a head coach, especially a first-year head coach, and contextually speaking with him, one who succeeded really well at the G6 level, I don't know. That's just inspiring. Again, I know it probably does not hold that much weight, but it's still better than the alternative. So,
yeah, and he mentioned, you kind of talked about him having high expectations. He mentioned Neil Brown did in the press conference that I think somebody, maybe Doug, the SID, somebody told him that I think we have the second oldest roster in the nation. So, it's definitely a new era of college football where a new roster doesn't necessarily mean a young roster. Roster turnover doesn't mean that you're plugging in underclassmen to fill those roles. So there is that. You got a lot of experience. You got a lot of older players. I think that it's fair to have expectations in year one for those reasons. And just honestly, Neil Brown has really impressed me with his speaking ability. Look, it doesn't necessarily translate to on-field results. Obviously, in his career, it has, but it's such a clear step up from the previous coaches. I think, especially early on, you heard Littrell get better at it. You heard Morris get better at talking to the media. I think, and not necessarily give the most coach-speak answers that they were at the beginning of their tenures here. But Neil Brown, I think you ask him questions, and it seems like he answers pretty honestly, and he gives obviously not as much information as he can. That's his job, is to be discreet about what he discloses. And I get that, but I think he does give fans something to work with in his media availabilities early on. So I've liked that. I think it's going to be not like listening to a Littrell availability where you fall asleep halfway through, or you kind of forget you're listening to it while you're working or doing whatever. So
all three phases.
Yeah, exactly. All three phases. And anytime they'd ask him a defensive question, he would say, "I'm not a defensive coach," even though he was a head coach. But anyways, different topic. But I mentioned this before. The DNA of this team, I think, is just going to be running the ball, and I think we know that. We're hearing more and more. It's looking like Taven Jackson's going to be the guy. There's not anything to the contrary there. And if he is the guy, one thing that I kind of look back on is the 2023 West Virginia team, again, that went 9-4. They had three guys who rushed for about the same yardage. They had Jaheim White led the team with like 842. And then Donaldson, the other running back, the bigger back, had a little shy of that. And the quarterback, Green, had about high 700 rushing yards as well. So you look at that attack, they had Jaheim White, they had a bigger running back, Donaldson, ended his career at Ohio State last season, and then Green, a mobile quarterback. And I think that we have potentially similar look with Jaheim White, Nick Osho, and then Taven Jackson. That's something that I think I'd be interested to see if that kind of plays out that way. That West Virginia team had a really good offensive line. I think we have a chance to have a good offensive line this year. Evan mentioned the depth. We've heard multiple names. Could potentially be that fifth starting role, and then the other guys who could be in that rotation. A name he mentioned was Julio Madero. I hadn't heard him mention that name or Morris last year, so it seems like he's a guy who's developed and come along to the fact that they're mentioning him now as a potential rotation guy at least. And then, Priester, Keon Johnson, Dylan Shaw, those are all guys I think are kind of fighting for a starting role. But again, I think that's going to kind of be the DNA of the team is running the ball. Early on, I know we don't have a ton to go off of, but it does seem like a lot of the principles that the offense kind of had under Morris, and even before that with Mike Blesh, a lot of that kind of veer and shoot stuff. I think that's going to be a big part of the offense. I think it's going to look kind of similar to what it looked like there under Blesh the last time. He is technically, I think, the run game coordinator, and Neil Brown's going to be calling the plays. But I think that Blesh is going to have a big hand in just the implementation setup. I think this offense is going to have a lot of his kind of DNA that he had last time. Carter, do you have any thoughts on, like I said, just kind of the way things are shaping up with how how the offense is going to look, how the game, the schemes might look in terms of the idea of playing to your personnel and playing to your strengths, because that does seem to be a theme that we're kind of hearing.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of mentioned it last week where I think Taven Jackson's abilities as a passer and rusher are able to open up an offense like this. I do like the assuredness of what you have at running back, obviously, with Jaheim White. Anytime you're basically restarting with a roster, you kind of like to have like an offensive anchor. I've kind of been going through and previewing a lot of college football teams this year, and just one thing I'm noticing is that the teams that I'm higher on are often teams like, especially, it doesn't even have to be G6, but just teams that are, hauling in a big transfer class. A lot of them have like one key guy they centered on. And I guess you could say that's Jaheim White in this offense, but I really do feel like Taven Jackson's going to be able to open up so much creative playmaking. Obviously, we're going to be utilizing tight ends, and kind of like Evan mentioned, we don't have a sure set wide receiver one, which is not always a necessity for college football teams. But, last year we had our top target guy, and we had our, anytime Drew passed the ball, you were pretty sure it was going to White Young. So, there is a change up there where there's probably going to have to be more of a unilateral team involvement. But I do think that Taven Jackson specifically being kind of pushed forward as a starter, his abilities are just going to open up so many opportunities for skilled guys around him. I don't think that he's, like a top 3 quarterback in the league or anything, but I do have confidence and assurance that I think the offense is going to be healthy pretty much all season, as long as he and Jaheim White are in the backfield, just because of what those two kind of raised the floor, I guess, so to speak. Which, especially, like I said, if you're starting over fresh with a mostly new offensive line, mostly new receiver group, and a new starting quarterback and a new running back, you need guys who can raise that floor and kind of keep things on the stable side. So I have kind of come around a little bit on Taven Jackson over the summer, and watching a lot of his tape and seeing what he's capable of doing on a football field. There are some pretty exciting moments, even from his stint at UCF. So that's kind of where my comfort lies, in that, I think as long as he and Jaheim White stay healthy, there will be at least a floor of being able to get creative on offense and get guys involved. And really, when you're starting over fresh, like I said, that's kind of all you need.
Yeah. Evan?
Yeah, I echo a lot of that sentiment. I personally, I had a preference lean for Taven Jackson, especially with the mold of kind of Neil Brown's offenses at times, from what I'd seen, and just kind of a bigger physical threat who can utilize their legs. Taven Jackson really fits that mold. If you go back and you look at some of his UCF tape, it is undeniable that Taven Jackson, if he could grow in consistency, could be an NFL quarterback. Like he does certain things that are freaky athletic. He has a big arm that's put on display. It's just the pocket awareness at times. And I think some of his, they had mentioned some of the mechanics of his throwing motion that needed to get nailed down, but he has it in him, and I think it's maybe when he is thinking less and just playing intuitively and building in confidence. And so maybe a change of scenery and a slowdown in competition might really be something that allows him to take a step forward in his game. And like you were mentioning, Billy, kind of like the veer and shoot offense, really the goal of that offense is, and it's really interesting when you watch a veer and shoot offense, the field just looks so much bigger because of the spacing that they put in their wide receivers. And they are going to really lean on the run to set up the big plays in the pass. And I think that the combination that we have of potentially Baron Tipton on the outside and Max Reese, I think that that's a name that'll be a household name as a safety blanket for Taven Jackson and, Swiss Army knife in the run game as well. I think that this offense could, in a very kind of different way at times, be equally potent in a quieter manner than some of the offenses we've seen in the past. And so I'm excited for it. I think Taven has a really high ceiling. I know a lot of people disagree with me on that, but I think that he has the tools, and I think there could be a lot going on in fall camp that we don't see. Neil Brown hasn't really strayed from Taven's doing what he needs to do. He's received praise in fall camp. He did just this last week. It doesn't really seem like he's letting go of that starting job, so that makes sense. And overall, I think that this team, just as a whole, will be really complementary to one another if we can kind of control that line of scrimmage on the defensive side, and then kind of dominate time of possession on the offensive side of the ball, and get a few chunk plays over the top with really, really big physical pass catchers that we have. I think that this offense could really, really do some damage and frustrate opposing defenses if it gets humming.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that, like we said, it sounds like Jackson's going to be the guy. At quarterback, we thought maybe there might be a competition there. Now it looks like the competition is probably for QB2 right now between Jimerson and Ditta. We're kind of hearing, a little bit of both. Probably feels like it's going to be Ditta at this point, but, we'll see. That'll be interesting to see because both of those guys have 4 years of eligibility left. So presumably whoever kind of wins that backup role could be basically the QB of the future or next season. You never know how college football goes, but that's kind of the position battle there. That's more likely going into fall camp. Obviously there's going to be a lot of position battles. We talked about cornerback. Looked like there was going to be a position battle maybe between Peyton Taylor and Chase Canada. Now it looks like they're both going to start, so maybe not as much there. I think there's quite a few position battles going on right now. Offensive line, Evan mentioned receiver. I think defensive line is probably has some, I think, ironing out to be done as far as like you got guys who are going to be in the rotation. You got guys like Rhodes and Anaha and what's his name? It's the defensive end from UTEP. What's his name? Ezeani.
Yep.
Yeah, I think he's going to be in the mix too. So, anyways, all that to say, it seems like we still have a lot of position battles that are kind of outstanding. Do either of you have any position battles that you're kind of keying on right now that you're seeing how that one's going to play out?
Yeah, I think for me personally, one that kind of shone through just in the media availabilities is that opposite starting safety spot to Brandon Jones.
Yeah.
A couple names that have been thrown around there, but one that I wasn't expecting to hear, and it sounds like he's really making a push to potentially get some significant playing time and potentially even start as Bryce Garza.
Yeah.
A returner, which I think is huge that we have, a few guys that are holdovers that are pushing for significant playing time and potentially starting roles. So that's a position battle that I'm really starting to look at, especially now with the corner spots kind of looking like they're starting to be locked down. That other safety spot, which I think, correct me if I'm wrong, another name that they've kind of thrown out there is Tay Seymour. That's also at that spot that's pushing for some pretty significant playing time. So that one's one that I'm watching. And then as far as the defensive line goes, a couple names that we heard. It sounds good that I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce it, but David Anoha apparently is really, really, showing out in fall camp. Neil Brown said that just on Tuesday. That's great. And then also, I'm gonna blank on another name. The defensive tackle from East Carolina.
Oh, Justin Benton.
Justin Benton has apparently been really disruptive along that defensive line as well. So I think that those two positions, as they kind of nail down they're too deep.
Yeah, for sure. And I think we haven't heard, from what I've been able to watch, we haven't heard a ton about the defensive tackle group. I know we've heard more about the edges and the ends, whereas tackle, I think Terrell Washington's names come up as a returner, come up a good bit. You mentioned Benton. I think Lorenzo, the defensive tackle from Illinois State, came with Ben Black. I think he's going to be in the mix too, but haven't really heard his name as much. And then also another guy defensively that I heard his name pop up, and this isn't as a starter, linebacker Brendan Reese, who was a signee last year under Morris. He stayed. He was a really big body guy. I think he's about 6'2", 235. A really impressive sized younger linebacker who looked like last year played some special teams. Looked like he can move pretty well as well. So that seemed like a guy who could be a player. And it sounds like he is in that too deep at linebacker with Cedric Roberts from Alcorn State as the other backup. And then, it sounds like Barker and Alexander are about as locked into the starting spots as it gets on this roster. So, but that kind of stuff I think is interesting as well, because you see who are the guys who they're not just on the roster, they're not just depth pieces, but they're actual legitimate too deep guys who are going to play, or they are truly one injury away, not just they'll move guys around. He wants to see the field. You mentioned Seymour. I think if I had to put money on it right now, I'd say I think he's going to be the starter at safety, just because he's got experience playing at Georgia Tech. He's an older player. I think he's going to be the starter, but the fact that he hasn't locked it down in the way Brandon Jones has tells me that I think there's still some room for some of the other guys. Bryce Garza, like you mentioned, that was really interesting to me. Again, we got some 2025 high school guys last season under Morris who've stayed, and I think it's ended up being pretty solid. Braden Knox at defensive end, I think, is a guy who could be a good player down the road. Or even this season, Brendan Reese at linebacker, Bryce Garza at safety, guys who we didn't see last year, but again, they were true freshmen. We didn't expect to see them. And then now as sophomores, we were able to retain them. And it looks to me like I think they could be, solid players in the Brown era. So that's always a good sign. Carter, is there anybody else who you're kind of, looking at potentially seeing who's going to start or who's going to maybe break into a role?
You guys kind of covered everything on defense that I was going to bring up. The only thing I would say, I guess, is I did see that Neil Brown said that there are 8 guys competing for receiver roles, which I think is promising for the depth, but kind of like Evan touched on a little bit earlier, there's not really one specific guy that kind of pops out to you, which is not so great. I talked last week about how high I am on James Tyre as a slot option. I think he's probably going to be my offensive breakout pick of the year. And there are guys in that depth chart that I like. Josiah Martin's one of them. Justin Stevenson. There are people in that wide receiver depth chart that I think could wind up moving up throughout the year. And kind of like I just talked about, I think that the way Taven Jackson plays football kind of opens up the door for, like a 5-6 deep receiver core. Plus, I like the tight end ads. So, I mean, I think that there's pass catchers abound, and that's, I guess, promising to have, like 8 to 10 guys who could pop up and make an impact early on. Like I said, you guys kind of covered everything on defense, so that would be my only thing on the offensive side of the ball. It's just I think that we're going to be able to see kind of a slow unfolding of multiple guys kind of getting involved in the pass catching game throughout the year.
Yeah, for sure. And what receiver is, I think, one of those position groups, and maybe we just got spoiled a little bit during the Morris era, but receiver is one of those positions where I feel like I want to see guys what guys do on Saturdays, because we've seen it a lot of times where maybe somebody is getting some praise in practice, but then they just kind of end up getting buried or end up not being a starter. Versus we've seen, I think at the beginning of the year, you're always going to see a deeper wide receiver rotation in terms of reps and targets. But then as the season goes on, you start seeing it kind of pare down. Like at the beginning of last season, Simeon Evans was in the mix, and some other guys were kind of, Miles Coleman, I think, was getting a little bit more early on. Then it became kind of the Wyatt Young, Cam Dorner show, and those were pretty much the lion's share of your targets going to those guys. What you want at that stage of the season, you want to be able to say, hey, these are our guys. We're going to feed them. We're going to let see how far they can take us. I think that's going to be the case at receiver this year. I think you're going to see. I don't know who it's going to be. You mentioned James Tyre. I think he's probably the best bet to start in the slot. And then outside guys, like it could be Tipton, it could be Martin, Stevenson, you name it. There's a lot of names in the mix, and I'm cool with that going into the season. I think you want to see who's the guy who's going to come down with a big play on Saturday, against Indiana or against UNLV. Who are those guys who are actually going to get open and make plays? And then everybody's going to get a chance, and I'm fine with that at receiver. And then you start to see as the season goes on, all right, who are our main guys? I think we saw it every year where, especially after Jalen Darden, it was kind of like a new guy every year. Like then, first it was Rod Burns, kind of came out of nowhere, and he just ended up being our guy. And then you saw guys like Damon Ward, DT Sheffield, and then obviously last year with Wyatt Young and Dorner. Every year, I think at receiver, you kind of see a host of names who all feel like they could be in the mix. They feel like they could have similar production, but then someone just kind of breaks out. And like I said, I think if there's one position to have maybe a little bit of uncertainty, I'm cool with it being receiver for that reason. Maybe it's just not as good a group this year. That's obviously the worry, but I think in general, we should see guys, and in general, it's just not going to be the same volume of passing attack that it was last year. But regardless.
If I can add one more thing too, the last couple of years, like you said, we've had a healthy, steady production of that.
Yeah.
But that's all been with quarterbacks who we thought could play here for more than 1 year, especially with Taven Jackson only having 1 year of eligibility. I think that's like the most important thing is like getting everybody as many reps as possible. Because this year you kind of need to find some skill guys who can, stick the landing and possibly be returnees next year, because you don't have Taven Jackson back in 2027. So,
yeah, no, for sure. And I think there are a lot of guys in this receiver room who I want to see them hopefully stay, because I think that year two in a system is kind of where you see guys make a jump, like kind of like a Blair Conrad, or even last year Wyatt Young was his second year in the offense. But again, we don't always have that luxury. A few years back, I don't know if you guys remember Trey Cleveland, the taller receiver. I felt like he was kind of coming on later in the season. I thought it would be a good, would have been a good jump in year two for him potentially, and then he left. So you never know when that happens. But I'd like to think some of these guys, if you can get them to stay, build some foundation with some of those guys this year, then hopefully retain them, and then see a jump in year two. But again, that's the trick in this era of college football. Evan, are there any other thoughts from you on anything here?
No, I think maybe just Neil Brown did mention James Tyre is having a really good day this season. One other name to shout out that I think is really encouraging. I love hearing names along the defensive line. We did hear Curly Thomas's name get mentioned as someone that stood out in practice, and he's a big-bodied guy on that defensive end spot. We need those guys to create some havoc in the backfield. And then I agree on the wide receivers. I mean, it just is kind of one of those positions where you don't know until you know.
Right.
And they just then someone just starts making big plays in the moment, and that goes for everybody on the team. No, we haven't played football yet. We haven't this hasn't mattered yet, and so everything can change. I think that all that is kind of what I see it summing up as, and I think Nick Osho is going to have a really big season as well. We've all kind of mentioned it. It seems like him and Jaheim are actually kind of splitting that first team reps, which is probably a little bit just because Jaheim's getting a little bit rehab and back into full contact. But I think that they trust him, and I think that he's going to kind of be a 1-2 punch on that backfield.
Yeah, for sure. And, one thing that Neil Brown also mentioned is that this upcoming Saturday, so that would be the 15th, is going to be the first real scrimmage. This past Saturday, they had what kind of looked like a scrimmage, but I guess it wasn't. It was more of like a structured they wanted to get some stuff on turf. They wanted to have the practice on the turf, and there were a lot of team sessions where they were using the full field. So it was kind of like a, I don't know, dress rehearsal scrimmage kind of deal. But it sounds like this scrimmage this Saturday, the 15th, is going to be, more of a true scrimmage. And then the next Saturday, the 22nd, is going to be the second scrimmage. That's going to be the last scrimmage of fall camp. That's going to be the end of fall camp. So it seems like that is, Neil Brown mentioned this, that's where they're going to kind of make their calls as far as who is going to be starting, who's going to be in the rotation, who's going to be, not in the rotation, who's going to be scout team, that kind of stuff will be made. So, critical week and a half here to see how that, everything shakes out. And it's just, it's always a tough thing in college football where you have to, tell guys that, hey, they're not starting or they're not going to be in the mix. I know Eric Morris mentioned this, but when you get guys coming down from P4 schools and they truthfully just kind of expect to start because there's the whole reason why they're moving down. And when that doesn't happen, sometimes there's some attitudes to manage in the locker room that aren't always easy to navigate. So, just as this next week and a half progresses, it's going to be interesting to see how things shake out, how the coaches manage that situation. We're obviously not going to be privy to a ton of that, but however that shakes out is going to be reflected on the field. So, one of those kind of behind the scenes moments where we won't, again, like Evan said, we won't know till we know. So, but again, we're close. I think that's the takeaway here is we're getting closer and closer. It's becoming more and more real. And then we got some guys with some flights booked to make it to that Indiana game. So that's pretty cool. So hopefully, again, times keep moving quick and we're there. We're playing football and watching the new Neil Brown era unfold. But I guess, that's about it. You guys got anything else before we go here?
Nothing on my end. Just excited. Even, we're going to play the reigning national champions, and we lost the best team in program history. And I'm still excited for football. I still just nothing can kill my love for this team and my excitement for the season. So,
yeah, awesome. All right, cool. Well, thanks everyone for listening this far. Like I said, we're getting closer. You've done it. You made it through summer. We're almost there. So, thanks for listening, everybody. Go Mean Green.
see you next week. Go Mean Green.